The morning smelled like old bread and fear, but mostly bread, warm, sour, slightly burnt. A smell that floated out of the half-empty bakeries lining the Theodosian streets. Life, or at least the illusion of it, still existed. Merchants straightening their fabrics, mothers dragging children away from pigeons, an old man arguing over the price of olives as if cannons hadn't been echoing across the land for days. That was Constantinople, or what was left of it, a city not dying in fire but in routine. I walked the same path I always did, past the crumbling statue of Theodora, her face chipped into a permanent wince, past the old wine seller who now sold oil for lamps, whispering prayers with every coin he touched, past a group of monks sweeping dust from a church floor that hadn't seen a full congregation in weeks. No one spoke of the siege. Not directly. They said the situation, or the noise, or those beyond the wall. Euphemisms stacked on silence like stones on a grave. My home was near the old wall, a crooked little house, crooked like its owner, my father. A man who still believed in miracles, but only the quiet kind. Bread rising despite no yeast. Lamps burning longer than oil allowed. Enemies turning away out of boredom rather than bloodlust. He was wrong, of course. But I loved him for it. This morning, he was sharpening a knife that had never been used for anything more violent than bread. His hands were steady, his eyes less so. "Eat," he said, not looking up. I did, because hunger was more honest than hope. News moved differently now, not through letters or criers, but through footsteps. The faster they ran, the worse the news. That morning, they ran. From the northern wall, from the harbor, from the gates. No one shouted. They didn't need to. When death approaches slowly enough, it doesn't need an introduction. I passed by the monastery. A child, no more than 10, was drawing with chalk on the stones. A ship, a sun, a horse. Then he looked at me. "Do you think the sea will save us?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He went back to drawing, but this time he drew fire. At the edge of the forum, someone had hung icons on a rope. Dozens of them swaying gently in the morning wind. Saints with cracked eyes, gold leaf peeling like scabs. They looked tired. So did the priest sitting beneath them. He wasn't praying, just waiting. A merchant nearby muttered, "They won't get past the chain." Another replied, "The chain won't stop God." Both were wrong. It wasn't the chain. And it wasn't God. It was time. And time doesn't care who built your walls. By midday, the sky darkened. Not with rain, but smoke. Someone was burning scrolls. Old ones. From the university. I watched a woman toss them into the flame, tears streaking soot on her cheeks. "Better ash than the hands of unbelievers," she whispered. But her hands shook. Because history doesn't burn clean. When the cannon fired again, closer this time, the ground flinched beneath my feet. Birds flew, doors shut, and somewhere, deep inside the stone of this ancient city, something cracked. Not a wall, not a gate, but the idea that we'd survive. I always entered Hagia Sophia through the northern gate, as if any other entrance would offend its ancient dignity. I did the same today, but the echo of my footsteps was different now. Hollow, hesitant, like the building was thinking twice about letting me in. The dome was still there, of course, towering, celestial, proud, but it no longer shimmered in soft hues of gold and blue. Today it looked gray, not the gray of clouds, but of something tired, the color of faith eroded by fear. A child bumped into me as I stepped inside, wrapped around my leg, then vanished as quickly as he appeared. His mother stood nearby, half veiled, half expecting. Her eyes weren't searching for her son. They were calculating how many exits there were. There's a type of love that holds on tight, and another that prepares to let go. A man kneeled in prayer by the central pillar, but his lips didn't move. Perhaps he was speaking with God inside his own head, or perhaps he'd run out of words. Some prayers aren't meant to be heard, only endured. The acoustics of Hagia Sophia were known to carry whispers to the heavens, but today it felt like the heavens had unplugged. By the baptismal font, 3 young men huddled close. One wept silently. One stared at the floor. One clutched an old icon so tightly it bent. None of them spoke. In silence, they built a kind of shelter. A final confession without words. A hammer rang from above. We all flinched. Looking up, I saw a figure ascending the spiral steps to the dome. For a moment, I thought it might be a soldier, come to drape the holy walls in cloth. But it was just a priest, climbing slowly, reverently, as if to say goodbye to the mosaics. He didn't look back. Even the pigeons parted for him. Hagia Sophia, once the throne of God on earth, was now a sanctuary for the unthroned. Near the east wall, I saw a woman pressing her palm flat against the stone. Her nails scratched the marble slightly. It wasn't grief. It was something older, like she was trying to merge with the building, or be buried with it. A whisper passed under the dome. A legend, not new but louder now. The emperor will vanish into Hagia Sophia and return only when the city is free again. I almost laughed. I actually did. Just once. Because faith often begins where truth ends. Near the narthex, an old man stared at the apse. Tears had formed, but he didn't wipe them away. He wore a priest's robe, but without the pride. His face looked like the building's facade. Weathered, cracked, but somehow still standing. At the exit, someone had left a parchment tucked into a cracked pillar, written in Latin. Et tu, Domus Dei. You too, House of God? As I stepped outside, a bird landed on my shoulder. It stayed just long enough for me to notice the softness of its weight. Then it flew off. A single feather remained. I tucked it into my pocket. Because sometimes history isn't carved in stone. It's hidden in something as light as a feather. The sea doesn't lie. Not like men do. It reflects what you give it. Wind, war, or whispers. That morning, it was glassy, unusually calm, as if the waters knew something we didn't, and were simply waiting for us to catch up. From the northern tower of Galata, I could see the ships. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Ottoman sails like black knives stabbing the skyline. And below them, smaller vessels, faster, twitchier, Genoese. The so-called allies. But alliance, I had learned, is just another word for temporary silence. The Genoese flag still fluttered, still painted in red and white, still Christian. But gold had a way of muting convictions. They traded with the Ottomans at night. Everyone knew. Everyone pretended not to. Even the sea kept the secret for now. From the walls, we watched a strange ballet unfold. Ottoman galleys rowing steadily toward the boom chain, that massive iron line we believed invincible. Behind it, Constantinople's harbor curled like a sleeping cat, and we told ourselves it was safe, that nothing could breach the chain, but chains rust. And sometimes, they open from within. A Genoese ship drifted too close that afternoon. Some say it was scouting. Others said it was delivering grain. I watched through a spyglass as crates were unloaded. Heavy, careful, suspicious. A sailor dropped one. It didn't crack. It clanged. Grain doesn't clang. The harbor was quieter than the land. No sermons, no screams, just the occasional creak of timber and the soft slap of oars cutting water. It almost felt peaceful. That's how you know you're in danger. When it all feels too quiet. At the docks, men played dice beside cargo meant for dying cities. They laughed too loudly. One wore a Venetian ring. Another had a Turkish scimitar slung lazily at his hip. The symbols blurred. This was no longer East versus West. This was prophet versus prophecy. And then came the rumor that Mehmed had ordered ships to be dragged over land, over the hills, through the forest, into the Golden Horn itself. It sounded absurd, until we saw the wooden tracks being built, until we smelled the tar, until we heard trees falling in rhythm. They weren't rumors anymore. By the third day, sails appeared on the hill. Ships on wheels. Ships on sleds. Ships where ships shouldn't be. People fell to their knees at the sight, not in worship, in disbelief. It was like watching the laws of nature unravel, one plank at a time. The sea, for all its depth, had been outmaneuvered, and so had we. The Ottomans had turned our greatest defense, our beloved water, into a joke. And like fools, we were still waiting for the punchline. Back at the tower, I looked again through the spyglass. A Genoese captain lit a lantern, flicked his wrist, and 3 Ottoman ships turned in sync. Coincidence? Number choreography. We weren't fighting a war. We were dancing to a song someone else was conducting, and we didn't even know the tune. The first time I saw him, I thought he was taller. Maybe it was the way he stood. Not proud, but deliberate, measured. He wasn't just walking along the walls. He was listening to them. Emperor Constantine XI, Palaiologos, last of the Roman emperors, last shadow of a fading sun. He walked the ramparts each morning, always before the city woke. His cloak fluttered behind him, heavy with the silence of 1,000 years. It wasn't woven with thread, but with memory and regret. I followed him once, not to speak, only to see if he ever hesitated. He didn't. He stopped occasionally to touch the stone, the Theodosian walls, once unconquerable, now pockmarked, cracked, tired, like him, like all of us. He would press his palm against the mortar, close his eyes, and I swear, the stones sighed. He had a way of looking beyond things, beyond the ships, beyond the treachery, beyond the inevitability. Some said he'd already made peace with death. Others said he believed in miracles. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw a third thing, a stubborn refusal to vanish quietly. There was no throne anymore. Not really. No gilded halls or crimson carpets. Just a city on life support and a man keeping vigil at its bedside. He didn't bark orders. He didn't scream. He whispered. But everyone listened. Because when marble begins to crack, you learn to hear the quiet shifts. That morning, a priest brought him a letter, sealed with the crest of the Genoese governor. He didn't open it. He burned it. Then looked at me and smiled like someone who had outlived the use of words. I once asked a soldier what he thought of the emperor. He said, "He's the only reason I haven't fled." Simple, sincere. One man's courage was all we had left, and somehow it was enough. That evening, I found him alone by the Golden Gate, the one that hadn't opened in decades. Legends said it would only open when the city would liberate it again. He ran his hand along the rusted hinges. They left a red streak on his fingers. Looked like blood. He didn't wipe it off. The sun dipped low, painting the walls in dying gold. He turned to me and said, "When the wall falls, I will not be behind it. I will be part of it." And he meant it. Not long after, he removed the imperial garments. No more purple, no more jewels, just armor, worn, dented, but real. The last emperor would not die in robes. He would die in iron. I never saw him again after the final charge. They say he fought like 10 men, that his sword shattered on the third wave, that his body was never found. But sometimes, at dawn, when the wind blows just right, I swear I hear footsteps on the wall, measured, deliberate, as if he's still there, still listening. The night before the city fell, it rained. Not hard, not dramatic, just a soft drizzle, like the sky couldn't cry properly anymore. Even the heavens were exhausted. The streets were slick, glistening like wet marble, not from glory, but from resignation. I walked past shuttered stalls, overturned carts, and abandoned icons. A cat darted between shadows. The baker's sign creaked with each gust of wind. The smell of flour lingered, faint, like a memory of mornings that wouldn't return. No one baked that day. There was no point. The ovens were cold. The city was colder. I passed a woman handing her child a piece of bread. It was hard as stone. She didn't chew. She watched him eat instead, memorizing the movement of his mouth as if it might be the last time. In the alley behind the church of St. Irene, young men sharpened knives on the stones. Not swords, knives. Because you don't always need a blade to win a battle. Sometimes you just need to survive the first 5 minutes. One of them asked me if I believed in miracles. I lied and said yes. At the monastery near the Blackernay Palace, monks lit candles for the dead. Before they were dead. Rows and rows of little flames flickering against the damp air. Each flame, a name. Each name, a hope. Each hope, a delay. By the docks, the Genoese were already packing. They claimed neutrality. They claimed brotherhood. They claimed they felt for us. But they felt nothing. Their ships were loaded with silk, spices, and silver, not souls. A young sailor offered to smuggle me out for a price. I asked if that price included my conscience. He didn't answer. The bells rang at midnight. All of them. For prayer? For mourning? For show? No one knew anymore, but their echo filled the city like a final breath. Drawn in, never exhaled. At Hagia Sophia, people gathered again, but it wasn't like before. No incense, no sermons, just the murmur of doubt. Some wept, some screamed, some kissed the walls. A priest dropped the Eucharist. It shattered. Nobody picked it up. I knelt beside a soldier. His hands were bleeding from clutching his sword too tightly. He said nothing, just stared at the altar and whispered a name, not Christ's, a girl's. In the corner of the nave, a child sang, soft, slow, tuneless. His mother didn't stop him. She just held his hand and looked up at the dome as if it might still crack open and let in a sliver of mercy. It didn't. That was the night. A night made of small endings, of quiet panic, of the last things people do when they don't know what else is left. The night before the city fell wasn't a thunderous farewell. It was a whisper, a murmur, a city exhaling into history. They say the moon bled that night, not metaphorically, not poetically, not in the way that people exaggerate things when they're afraid. No, truly. The moon rose over Constantinople like a bloodied coin, hanging low and heavy in the eastern sky. It was no ordinary full moon. It was an omen. Even the men who mocked superstition fell quiet, because deep down, everyone believes in something when death is circling the walls. The priests said it was a sign. The scientists said it was a lunar eclipse. The old women just closed their shutters and muttered prayers in languages no one remembered. I stood on the wall beside a soldier named Lucas. He'd never feared battle. But when he saw the red moon, he kissed the ring on his finger 3 times and whispered the name of a saint I'd never heard. Not all shields are made of metal. The city felt suspended that night, as if time itself was holding its breath. Shadows moved strangely. Dogs refused to bark. Birds didn't fly, and even the rats seemed to vanish underground. Something was coming. Something more than armies and cannons. Something ancient. I passed a courtyard where fortune tellers had once read palms. The stall was empty now. A single candle remained lit. Its flame danced erratically, as if trying to escape its own fate. I saw a mother wrap a child in wool, not because of cold, but because of silence. She told him not to speak until the sun came back. She promised it would. I wasn't so sure. The red moon cast shadows differently. Everything looked warped, elongated. Even the great dome of Hagia Sophia seemed to bow under its glow. Some said they saw figures moving across it. Others claimed angels had abandoned the city. One man ran naked through the Forum of Constantine, shouting that he saw fire raining from the stars. He wasn't mad. He was just early. And yet, despite all this, some still hoped that the Hungarians would arrive, that the Pope would send ships, that God would blink and undo it all. But the moon did not blink, and neither did the Sultan. In the imperial chapel, Constantine prayed alone. He didn't ask for victory. He asked for meaning. That whatever happened next would matter. That we wouldn't just be another forgotten ruin dissolved by dust and time. Later that night, a crack split the sky. Thunder, perhaps, or cannon fire from across the field. The Ottomans tested their new siege engine, and the city trembled. But it wasn't the boom that haunted me. It was the silence after. So still, so wide, so final. The moon watched it all, unblinking, unmoving, as if it had seen countless cities fall before us and would see countless more. Its red glow soaked the domes, the minarets, the statues, until everything looked dipped in blood. And maybe it was. You wouldn't have survived that night because the fear wasn't loud. It was quiet. Too quiet. And it came not from outside the walls, but from the cold certainty that no help was coming. That fate had already made up its mind, and the moon was just there to make sure we understood. I woke to the sound of the wall screaming, not in words, but in cracks. You don't know what stone sounds like when it's giving up. It doesn't shatter. It groans. It protests. It dies slowly, with dignity. The Ottomans had brought a monster. They called it the Basilica, a cannon so large it needed 60 oxen to drag it, 16 feet long, 24 inches across. But it wasn't the size that terrified me. It was the rhythm. Boom. Wait. Boom again. Each shot was like a heartbeat. Only, it wasn't ours. I climbed the stairs of the Theodosian wall, gripping a sword I barely knew how to use. My hands were trembling. Not from fear of death, but from fear of being useless. A man can make peace with dying. It's harder to accept that you might not matter at all. Below us, the earth had changed. What was once open field was now a forest of tents, towers, and siege machines. Turkish engineers worked like ants, tireless and precise. They weren't just here to conquer, they were here to erase us. The first breach came before sunrise. A low groan, then a rumble, then silence, and then collapse. A section of the outer wall gave way like rotted bread. Stone spilled outward. Dust rose like a ghost. And through the haze, they came. I remember the first soldier who reached us. He was no older than I was. His blade was chipped. His eyes were calm. He didn't yell. He didn't charge. He just walked forward, as if this were a duty, and we were the final chore. I killed him. Or someone next to me did. It happened too fast. All I remember is the look on his face just before he fell. Not fear, not pain, just surprise. Then came the storm. They surged through the gap, climbing over bodies, swinging scimitars, screaming words I didn't understand. The air turned to smoke and blood. You couldn't see 10 feet ahead. You swung at shadows and prayed they bled. I slipped. Someone's blood. Maybe mine. I don't know. A mace hit the wall near my head. Stone chipped into my eye. I blinked it out and kept fighting. I thought about my mother. And then, ashamed, I thought about running. The Genoese commander Giustiniani was there. Steel armor, blue sash, voice like thunder. He rallied us. For a moment, we pushed them back. Not far, just enough to breathe. But breathing felt like treason. A soldier beside me dropped to his knees. No wound, just dropped. His eyes were open. His mouth, too. I touched his shoulder. He didn't blink. And I realized then, you don't always die from the blade. Sometimes you die from the knowing, from the moment you realize you were never going to make it out. Eventually, we sealed the breach. Barely. Piled stones, burned timber, dead men. We stood among the rubble like ghosts, pretending to still be alive. The sun rose slow and red, dragging light across a wall that no longer believed in itself. Giustiniani limped away. He wouldn't return. The cannon reloaded. The rhythm resumed. Boom. Wait. Boom again. And we waited too. Not for death, but for the next breach. Because once the wall knows it can fall, it never forgets how. They say every great city has a secret way in. A forgotten tunnel. A priest's passage. A door meant only for the emperor. Or the devil. In Constantinople, that door was called the Kirkaporta. Just a small gate. Almost nobody knew it existed. Almost nobody. The legend said it was once used by monks to fetch water from the outer gardens before the new aqueduct was built. Others claimed it was built as a final escape route in case the city fell. It was supposed to be sealed, locked, buried in time. But the thing about legends, they're always truer than we want them to be. The morning after the first breach, while the great cannon was being cleaned, while our wounded were still moaning in chapel halls, someone opened the gate. No one knows who. Some say it was a deserter. Some say it was a janitor who never came back. Others whisper that it was opened from the outside, by those who already knew where to look. I was near the monastery of Pantocrator when the warning came. A runner, no armor, no breath left, just blood on his tunic and terror in his voice. They're inside the walls. We didn't believe it, couldn't. There were no booms, no fire, no ladders, just silence. Until there wasn't. The first screams came from the artisan district, mothers bolting doors, sons grabbing butcher knives, dogs howling. Then smoke. Then steel. A few of us rushed toward the lower gate district. We expected to find another breach in the wall. We found a door, still open, creaking like it was proud of its betrayal. Through it, a stream of janissaries moved like oil, cold, smooth, and unstoppable. We tried to fight. 10 of us. 20, maybe. It didn't matter. They had momentum. We had confusion. They had purpose. We had questions. The kind of questions that get you killed. One of the old guards, Demetrios, screamed at me, "Seal the gate! Seal it!" I tried. I really did. But by the time we reached it, they were already behind us. And the gate. The lock had been removed. Neatly. Intentionally. You wouldn't survive this part of the fall, not because of steel or fire, but because of doubt. Doubt kills faster than swords. It eats strategy. It rots courage. By the time orders were given, they were meaningless. By the time reinforcements arrived, there was nothing left to reinforce. The Kirkoporta wasn't the biggest breach, but it was the first that broke us from the inside. We had spent weeks watching the walls. We should have watched ourselves. Later that day, I found a scroll in the dust outside the church, near the Forum Bovis. It was a list of names. Young men conscripted to guard the lesser gates. Half the names were crossed out. I didn't know any of them, but I sat there for a moment, reading them aloud like a prayer, because someone should. Somewhere in the city, that little door was still swinging open, as if history hadn't yet decided what it wanted to do with us. But it had. Oh, it had. There comes a moment in every doomed story where the hero realizes the ending has already been written. For Constantine the 11th, that moment came without a trumpet. No last command, no divine light, just a sword in his hand, and the sound of his city crumbling behind him. He wore no golden robes that morning, only a breastplate scraped with age, and a red cloak stiff with the blood of others. Gone was the Byzantine crown. In its place, dust, sweat, and resolve. You wouldn't have recognized him as a ruler. He looked like a man, because that's all he was now. Word had reached him before dawn. The Kirkoporta had failed. The Ottomans were inside. The cannons would resume at any hour. The prayers had gone quiet. The bells were cracked. Still, he did not flee. I stood at the Blachernae Palace when I saw him, not marching, walking, calm, alone, like a man on his way to keep an appointment with death. No entourage, no fanfare, just steel on his hip and silence in his wake. Some begged him to run, to board a Venetian ship, escape through the Golden Horn, live to fight another day. But Constantine knew something they didn't. This was the end of the world. At least, his world. He joined the front lines at the Mesotikian breach, not behind the wall, not from a balcony, but in the mud, beside farmers with spears and monks holding crucifixes like clubs. He didn't give a speech. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. The enemy came like thunder, wave after wave, steel and fire and banners that caught the wind like sails. We broke. We always broke. But each time, the emperor stood his ground, not because he thought he'd win, but because losing well was the only victory left. He killed more men than I could count, not with grace, with fury. He roared like a lion, even when his armor cracked and his leg began to bleed through his boot. I lost sight of him in the chaos. Smoke swallowed us. The cries of the dying drowned all else. Later they said his body was never found, that the Sultan ordered it buried beneath the rubble out of respect or fear. Others say he was torn apart, that his head was paraded on a pike. But I don't believe any of it. I believe he vanished into the blood and dust the same way the Empire did. Not with a bang, but with a question. Was it worth it? You wouldn't have survived that final stand, because it wasn't about surviving. It was about refusing to run. It was about becoming a legend, because history had run out of heroes. And in that moment, as the last Roman emperor disappeared into the breach, we all understood. The city was gone, but something greater had just been born. No cannon fired, no trumpet sounded, no parchment declared the end. It just happened. One moment we were fighting. The next, the fighting stopped. Not because we won, but because we were already lost. When the gates opened fully, the army didn't rush in like a beast. It flowed in, like smoke seeping under doors. Silent, relentless, inevitable. The Ottomans didn't need to burn the city to take it. We had done that ourselves. The fires lit during the chaos of retreat became a crown of flame around the city's domes. Ash rained like confetti. And through it, men screamed, not in pain, in triumph. The first screams I heard weren't of soldiers. They were from children being dragged from alleyways and from mothers who realized they would never find them again. They say war is hell, but hell at least has rules. Looting doesn't. The men were looking for gold. The women, well, they were looking for mercy. They found neither. Churches that had stood for 1,000 years were cracked open like eggs, mosaics smashed, chalices stolen, altars defiled. In the Hagia Sophia, they tried to hold a final prayer. Crowds gathered under the dome like sheep, hoping the wolves would honor the sanctuary. They didn't. The Janissaries stormed in first, swords drawn, shouting not in rage, but celebration. One of them laughed as he grabbed the golden gospel book and tossed it to the ground like garbage. Another struck the icon of Christ with the butt of his spear, shattering the face of a god that had once watched over emperors. I hid in a side chapel, beneath a broken statue of the Virgin. There were already others there. Old men, a young girl clutching a doll, 2 priests who had run out of prayers. No one spoke. We just listened to the sound of a civilization being unmade. Outside, the streets turned into rivers, not of water, but of things. Jewels, furniture, books, bodies. Anything that could be carried was carried. Anything that resisted was broken. The Ottomans had promised their soldiers 3 days. 3 days of loot, of reward, of revenge. We didn't know if the clock had started, but we knew it hadn't ended. You wouldn't survive this part because survival requires hope. And there was none left. Not in the eyes of the invaders, not in the hearts of the conquered. Only emptiness and gold and silence between screams. At one point, I stepped over a broken harp lying in a puddle of ink. The music and the words, both lost. I picked up a torn page. It read, "Lord, deliver us." He didn't. They say the city fell at sunrise, but it wasn't the rising sun that changed everything. It was his arrival. Mehmed, the conqueror, just 21 years old, and walking into the broken skeleton of an empire like it was built just for him. The looting was still going when his horse clopped through the forum. Shops ransacked, statues toppled, corpses strung like laundry across railings. The Janissaries stopped. Even the dogs stopped, because he had arrived. No cheering, no music, just the sound of hooves on cracked marble and the wind rattling torn banners. He was silent, face unreadable, not triumph, not sorrow, something deeper, something imperial. I watched from the upper floor of a shattered townhouse. He looked smaller than I expected, but his presence, it filled the square like incense. He dismounted slowly, not like a conqueror, more like a pilgrim, and he walked, not toward the palace, but toward the Hagia Sophia. The doors were broken, the icons smashed, the floor streaked with blood and candle wax. He stepped over the debris and looked up at the dome. The same dome that had once made emperors weep. The same dome Justinian had called his crown. Now it echoed only silence. He picked up a handful of dust from the floor, let it run through his fingers, and whispered something in Turkish. I didn't catch the words, but the weight of them made the guards lower their eyes. Then he turned and ordered the looting to stop. 3 words. That's all it took. The swords dropped, the screaming dimmed, and the city took its first breath as something new. Later that day, they said he ascended the pulpit, not to preach, but to declare the great church a mosque. No hammering, no speeches, just a rug laid over cracked mosaics and a bowed head facing Mecca. The transformation was quiet, but absolute. You wouldn't survive this moment. Not because it was violent, but because it was final. This was the end of Byzantium. Not in battle, not in fire, but in stillness. He rode to the palace next, the Blackernay, where emperors had lived and ghosts now roamed. The gate was ajar, the throne room looted. A crown had been trampled into the dirt like garbage. He didn't sit on the throne. He stood beside it, looked out the broken window, and said, "What a city we have taken." That evening, the call to prayer rang through Constantinople for the first time. It was soft, solemn, strange. We didn't understand the words, but we understood the meaning. The world had turned, and we were just pages in someone else's chapter now. When the final fires burned low and the ash stopped swirling in the air like funeral confetti, the city was no longer screaming. It had grown quiet, not with peace, but with exhaustion. And it was then, in that unbearable stillness, that I began to notice them. The ghosts. They weren't specters in the supernatural sense. No white sheets, no howling winds, no eerie footsteps. These were quieter, more tragic phantoms, the kind born not from death, but from memory. The empire had collapsed, yes, but its echoes still clung to every brick and balcony, refusing to let go. I wandered the streets that night, not because I was safe, but because there was nowhere left to hide. The smell of burned parchment mixed with the sweetness of crushed grapes. A strange scent, almost festive, as if the city was mocking its own demise. Here, a wine shop with its doors torn off, glasses still on the tables, as if the patrons might return from church and ask for another round. There, a school with open windows, chalk still resting beside incomplete lessons. The Latin word for hope scrawled halfway across the slate. I passed a house I had once visited as a boy. The old woman who lived there would feed pigeons from her balcony, claiming they were the souls of saints. The balcony was gone now. So were the birds. But the seeds were still there, scattered on the ground, like offerings no one had come to claim. I think what struck me most was not the devastation, but the absence. Absence of order. Absence of answers. Absence of the Byzantium we had known all our lives. The libraries were silent, not because they were empty, but because no one could read what remained. A pile of manuscripts smoldered in the ruins of the University of Constantinople, their ink bleeding into the stone like knowledge trying to escape its own grave. The statues seemed confused, marble emperors in winged victories, now headless or half-buried, gazing toward a skyline that no longer recognized them. Even the air felt heavier, as if the city itself were ashamed. I passed a courtyard where boys had once practiced rhetoric. Now it was filled with looters dragging candelabras from chapels and arguing in tongues I didn't understand. The Byzantines were gone. But the city had no idea who it belonged to now. You wouldn't have survived this part, not because of violence, but because of the unbearable weight of things no longer being what they were. There's a unique kind of pain in watching a place forget itself. In the Forum of Constantine, someone had erected a crude banner in Turkish. It flapped in the wind above the broken base of the Emperor's column. I stood beneath it, staring up at a night sky that hadn't changed even as everything beneath it had. I thought of the people. Where had they gone? Some were enslaved, others slaughtered. Many had fled, eastward, westward, or simply inward, retreating into whatever silence could shield them from grief. But some, like me, had stayed, not out of courage, out of disbelief. You see, empires don't end like stories. They unravel, slowly, silently, like a thread pulled from a rope, until all that's left is a handful of gold and a memory of warmth. That night, I sat on the steps of the Basilica cistern, watching rats drink from puddles of rain and blood. I closed my eyes. I could still hear the chants, the bells, the debates in the Senate, the hymns at Easter. But when I opened them again, there was only stone and smoke, and the long, aching breath of a city that would never again speak my name. They had promised glory, not in whispers, not in riddles, but loudly, proudly, in the clamor of churches and courts, in the voices of emperors and patriarchs, in every stone laid across 7 hills. They said this city would never fall, that God himself had drawn its boundaries, that it stood not just for empire, but for eternity. But now the only voices left were wind and memory. I walked through what was once the heart of a world, past forums where senators debated the nature of divinity, now filled with the cackling of wild birds and the creak of splintered wood. Past bathhouses that once echoed with poetry, now blackened with soot and urine. And it was in those ruins, not in the glory of conquest, not in the gold of palaces, that I began to understand the price we had paid. You wouldn't have survived it because it requires something most of us are never taught to bear. The quiet after the collapse. That long, unbroken silence where no one comes to save you, where the weight of what was lost settles in your bones like cold water in stone cracks. Once, we had thought our walls invincible, that 16 kilometers of masonry, laid out like sacred geometry by Theodosius himself, would guard us until the end of time. But time doesn't care for geometry, or legacy, or prayer. It just erodes, bit by bit, weak brick by rusted gate, pride by poor decision. Until what you're left with is not an empire, but its echo. I sat in the ruins of a church, not one of the great cathedrals, but a humble neighborhood parish where old women had lit candles for sons who never returned. Its walls were mostly gone, the roof had caved, but one small fragment of fresco remained. Half a face, Christ, I think, painted with the kind of reverence that only lives in faith deeper than reason. Even that face was fading, flaked by wind, scratched by time. What had we clung to? We called ourselves Romans, but Rome hadn't ruled in centuries. We wore silk and whispered Greek prayers, surrounded by mosaics and relics, and dreams of Justinian's dome. But all of that had been held together with illusions, and now the curtain was down. I heard stories of scholars who fled west, carrying books that would one day light the fires of the Renaissance. It was comforting, in a way, to think that something of us would survive. A verse, a formula, a thought. But what about the rest? What of the shopkeepers, the street performers, the children playing in cisterns? What of the nameless thousands who didn't flee, who couldn't flee, who simply became part of the dust? No Renaissance for them. Only silence. You wouldn't have survived it, because it wasn't the sound of conquest that kills you. It's the aftermath, the slow realization that no one is coming to rebuild what was yours. That history, for all its grandeur, has no sympathy for what it buries. At sunset, I watched as a group of Ottoman engineers surveyed the land. They spoke in calm, efficient voices, measuring, planning, already dreaming of what this city could become when it was no longer Byzantine, and it struck me. How quickly one world becomes another. How thin the veil is between a monument and a ruin. They had promised glory, and perhaps, for a while, we had it. But glory, it seems, is always bought with blindness. And in the end, it leaves you with dust on your lips and echoes in your ears, and a lesson that comes too late for those who needed it most. They say every city has a final door, not the gate the armies breach, not the archway a conqueror rides through on horseback, but the metaphorical kind, the last passage you walk through as one world ends and another silently waits to begin. And on that last day, I found myself standing before one. It wasn't grand. It wasn't even whole. Just a battered wooden doorway tucked beneath a collapsed colonnade, half buried in rubble, its lintel charred, its hinges hanging like broken limbs. But something about it, something made me stop. Perhaps because it was the only thing still standing. Or perhaps because I had nothing left to follow but instinct. I stepped through, and what I saw was not ruin, but memory. A once beautiful courtyard, its flagstones cracked and lifted by creeping vines. A shattered fountain still trickling faintly, like a throat trying to remember how to sing. And silence. Not the kind imposed by conquest, but the deep, sacred silence of a place that knew it had once mattered and didn't need anyone's permission to remember. There was a bench, marble, though, chipped. I sat. The sun had begun its descent, casting a long amber glow across the broken floor. Dust danced in the hair like pale ghosts, catching the light, then disappearing into shadow again. I realized then, the city had not died in fire, nor in the thunder of cannon. It had died in forgetting, in the quietness of people walking away and never looking back. I thought of my father, who once told me that Constantinople was a living idea. Not just walls and churches, but a philosophy, a harmony between heaven and earth. And now I understood that ideas, no matter how powerful, can be smothered by time if no one remains to speak them aloud. You wouldn't have survived this part, because survival here wasn't about food or violence or even hope. It was about stillness, about standing inside the bones of a world and not weeping. That kind of survival demands that you watch something holy be desecrated and yet still find a reason to rise the next day. It asks that you be both mourner and witness, both the last of the old and the first of nothing. As the light faded, a cat wandered into the courtyard. It moved with the serenity of something that had always belonged here. It looked at me, not with fear, but with the indifference of a native. And in that moment, I felt like the intruder. The city had begun to reshape itself, not in marble or decree, but in silence, in cracks and overgrowth, in wind slipping through mosaics no longer interpreted by priests. I heard bells once. I don't remember if they were real or imagined, perhaps from a church still standing far away, or from memory, or from some other life. They sounded hollow, like the last echoes of something once profound. I rose from the bench, my legs stiff, my eyes stinging with the grit of stone and sorrow. The door I had entered through now stood behind me, less a passage now than a question. Would I leave? Would I move forward into a city I no longer recognized? One that would rename streets, paint over murals, build minarets where crosses once stood? Or would I stay and dissolve into the bones of what had been? You wouldn't survive this moment, not because of fear, but because of choice. Because the hardest part of the Fall of Constantinople was not the siege, not the slaughter, not even the silence. It was standing on the edge of history, 1 foot in the past, one in a future you never asked for, and realizing that neither wants you anymore. And still, as I crossed back through the broken door, I carried something with me. Not pride, not vengeance, just memory. The last treasure of the fallen. I was there when the marble cracked, not in the chronicles, not in the paintings or in the chants of distant minarets, but in the breathless silence after the last footstep echoed off the stones. I was there when the sky held its breath, when the sun dipped behind broken domes like it too couldn't bear to watch. And I remember not the sound of conquest, but the weight of its aftermath. You wouldn't have survived, not because of her body, but because of your heart. Because there are endings the flesh can withstand, but the soul cannot bear. The city had no more songs to give. Its choirs had fled, its scribes silenced, its candles blown out by winds not of heaven, but of ambition. The old men who once recited law beneath shaded arches now sat dumbstruck beside barrels of ash. The women who washed linen in the fountains now had no fountain, no linen, no time for mourning. The children? They had learned too quickly to stop asking questions. And I had nothing but memory. I remembered what it used to feel like to walk from the harbor to the forum and smell bread baking on every corner, to hear bells from 10 churches at once, to pass mosaics that shimmered like constellations made of glass and gold. Now the air smelled of fire and damp stone, and no one rang the bells anymore. You wouldn't have survived it, because the final blow isn't cannon or steel. It's forgetting. It's waking up one morning and realizing that no one speaks your tongue in the marketplace, that your saints are no longer named aloud, that the street you grew up on has a new name, and the graveyard your mother rests in is being cleared for bricks. And yet I remained. I remained not because I had nowhere to go, but because someone had to remember. Because a city doesn't truly die until its last witness forgets how it lived. In time, the invaders rebuilt. New rules, new songs, a new shape to the skyline, and the city began to breathe again. Differently, but unmistakably alive. But beneath that breath, beneath every new stone laid, there was another heartbeat. Quieter, older, mine. I walked the new avenues, greeted the new lords, watched new children play in what had once been battlegrounds, and I never said a word, because history doesn't need my words. It only needs that I remember. So if you ever visit this city, and your feet fall softly on the worn stones, and you feel the hairs on your neck rise at the echo of something you can't quite name, that is me. That is my presence, my memory. That is the last flicker of an empire too proud to scream, too stubborn to die cleanly, too beautiful to forget. You wouldn't have survived the fall of Constantinople, but perhaps, just perhaps, you would have remembered it. And that, in the end, is all survival really is. Cities fall, names vanish. Even the strongest walls crumble in time, but memory endures when someone chooses to carry it. If this story left a mark, if you want to return again to other lost worlds, I invite you to subscribe. No fanfare, no noise, just a quiet bond between those who refuse to let history sleep forever.